Archaic Records.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. And today we're going to go back to 1977 to take a look at the second album, Leave Home, by one of the most important bands in the history of its genre. Actually, I think you could make the argument that this is one of the most important bands in the history of any genre. That being, of course, the Ramones. Now, the Ramones formed in Queens, New York in 1974. The band released its self-titled debut album in 1976. And to me, it is a no-brainer that the Ramones are one of the Mount Rushmore bands in the history of punk rock based on their significance. But apart from that, the Ramones have also sort of represented, in my opinion, sort of a good jump-in point for people who are looking to become a little bit more familiar with the scene's classic era. For one reason, the Ramones are about as punk rock as it gets, and they've been around since the scene's inception. And two, because the Ramones, although yes, they are very punk rock, they are at the same time very accessible. They are very user-friendly. They are as much pop as they are punk, and they always were. Their music is aesthetically pleasing. And I mean, who doesn't love Joey Ramone's voice? Now, my personal relationship with the Ramones goes back pretty much as far as I can remember. I don't remember a time in my life when I at least hadn't heard the name Ramones, but the first time I know that I became familiar with the Ramones was probably around middle school. I was probably up late one evening watching cable after my parents went to bed when I stumbled upon the classic film, Rock and Roll High School. And I remember that was the first time that I was really able to actually put a face and a sound to the Ramones, which was something that I had heard of going as far back as I could possibly remember. I didn't really necessarily become a Ramones fan, however, until probably right after high school, when I first started listening to Billy Idol, and through Billy Idol getting turned on to Generation X, and through Generation X really becoming a fan, an obsessive fan of the classic early days of punk rock. I remember there was a record store in my hometown called The Underground, where I pretty much spent all of my paycheck that didn't go to rent. And I remember the first time I bought a Ramones CD being, somewhat self-conscious because I didn't really know much about the band at the time. And I didn't really know at what point, should you sort of jump in. And I remember taking the CD up to the counter. And of course, back in those days, we still had the sort of snotty record store clerks, which is a thing that's sort of, sadly kind of gone extinct because now record stores are such a sort of, such a community, and it's such a, niche thing that everybody that works in record stores now are actually quite pleasant. Now, that's not a bad thing, but I do sort of reminisce, and I miss the days of the sort of snotty record store clerks who were intimidating and would often make me think twice about my purchases before I walked them up to the counter. But I remember buying my first Ramones CD. I think it was Rocket to Russia. It might have been the first record. I don't really remember that far back at this point in time. Sometimes I have brain atrophy, as I'm sure it's obvious to anybody who watches this channel. But I remember the clerk was, "Oh yeah, the Ramones, yeah." And I was like, "Yeah, of course. God, who do you think you're talking to?" But on the inside, I was like, just please ring it up, sir. I'd like to go now. Quite embarrassed here. I don't know what I'm doing. But I remember taking whichever Ramones CD it was first that I purchased home, listening to it. And I've been just an enormous, obsessive sort of fan ever since. Now, this record, of course, came out in January of 1977. It was produced by Tony Bongiovi and Tommy Ramone. I'm probably mispronouncing Bongiovi. And to me, this record is an essential to anybody that is a record collector, one, and a fan of punk rock, two. Now, to me, This record isn't. This record is sort of kind of suffers from middle child complex in the sense that it's not quite as good to me as the Ramones' self-titled debut album, and it's not quite as good as the record that would come after this one, Rocket to Russia. But that being said, this record to me is still borderline classic. I mean, that's how good the Ramones were, especially back in this classic era. Even an album that was maybe not quite as good as the one before it or the one after it is still like borderline classic. Now, stylistically, this record isn't a huge leap from the Ramones' 1976 debut album, nor would it be a big leap following this record when the band put out Rocket to Russia. The Ramones never really evolved that much throughout their career. They remained somewhat static, but, you know, when you achieve perfection, basically, in your first swing of the bat, I mean, do you really have a need to sort of improve on perfection? I would make the argument, possibly not. This is a record, though, that I do go back and I listen to all the time. This particular copy is not an original press, sadly. I believe this is the 2014 remastered version of it. I've always loved the artwork on it. I've always been a huge fan. Now, I'm a huge fan of the Ramones, basically most of the way through their catalog. But I really especially love the records with the original lineup. That's nothing against Marky Ramone, who of course would come in and he would pound the skins through probably the majority of their career. But I've always really loved the records with the original lineup. And really, I'm a huge fan of the band going all the way up really into sort of the late 80s. I mean, it really wasn't until the mid to late 80s, to me, that the Ramones ever really started putting out anything that you could sort of call clunkage. And like I said, this record, although not quite as good in my opinion as the first or third, this record to me it's a classic. I mean, you have to have it. I listen to this record all the time. I still listen to the Ramones as much as any other band that I listen to, not counting Mr. Stephen Patrick Morrissey or probably David Bowie. But I first became a Ramones fan when I was probably 18 years old. Almost 30 years ago, son. And this is a band that I still listen to almost weekly, at least. I put on a Ramones record, still to this day. Anyway, the first song on this record is a song called Glad to See You Go. This is a song that was written by Dee Dee Ramone about his ex-girlfriend, Connie Grip. Now, if you're sort of unfamiliar with who Connie Grip is, in the sort of Ramones lexicon, Connie Grip was a stripper and a heroin addict and an all-around lovely gal who had a very famously tumultuous relationship with Dee Dee Ramone. Now, you can say that Connie Grip was a stripper and a heroin addict, which is true. And you can sort of say, wow, man, poor Dee Dee. God dang, how did you end up with this chick in your life? But I think it's fairly safe assumption to say that Dee Dee Ramone was probably a bit of a handful himself back in 1977. If you read any of the books about the Ramones, or if you watch any of the documentaries about the band, Connie Grip's most famous transgression, of course, if you go back and study the history of the band, is when she stabbed our friend Dee Dee Ramone right in the derriere, which resulted in him becoming the butt of his friend's jokes for many years that followed. And the butt of jokes of mediocre YouTubers like me. This is a song that I love. I pretty much love most of the songs on this record. Saying that this album isn't quite as good as the one before it or the one after it, I mean, there really isn't like a bad song on this entire record. I really love this record. The second song on this album is Gimme Gimme Shock Treatment. I mean, there's really not much you can say about Gimme Gimme Shock Treatment. I mean, lyrically, it's pretty self-explanatory, except to say that to me, this is one of the greatest punk rock songs of all time. I mean, the Ramones that are just they were just responsible for just a shopping cart full of some of the greatest songs in the history of punk rock. Gimme Gimme Shock Treatment being no exception to that. The third song on this record is I Remember You. This is a song that has sort of a little bit of a slower tempo. This is a song that Joey Ramone wrote about one of his former girlfriends. To me, this sort of shows it sort of illustrates what I explained earlier, that the Ramones, despite being one of the punkiest punk bands of all time and one of the most important punk bands of all time, this is a band that had a real pop sensibility. Of course, all of the members of the Ramones were very obsessed with sort of 60s pop, bubblegum pop music and 50s doo-wop. And that was a sound that they really sort of mastered, within the confines of punk rock. I mean, I Remember You it's one of my favorite Ramones songs of all time. I actually really like their poppier, sort of down-tempo stuff. I love Joey Ramone's voice. I've always loved Joey Ramone's voice, but especially on songs like this. I Remember You is one of my favorite songs in the catalog. It's easily one of my favorite songs on this record. The next song after that is Oh, Oh, I Love Her So. I mean, holy crap. This is another one of those songs that has that kind of like 60s, bubblegum, sort of bred with punk rock. This is just, your kind of basic pop love song. I mean, this is something that the Ramones just always excelled at. Again, Joey Ramone's voice complemented this style of music to me just perfectly. And like I said, stylistically, the Ramones were, their music was, it was accessible, it was user-friendly, it was aesthetically pleasing, it was catchy. And, if you don't read too much into some of their darker lyrics, you can say, oh yeah, this is just kind of fun, bouncy. I love this song. I love when the Ramones do the kind of 60s pop influence. The next song after that is a song called Carbona Not Glue. Carbona was a fabric stain removing product back in the 1970s. And apparently it had a similar effect to glue when it was huffed or inhaled. And apparently the Carbona company sued Sire Records to have this song removed from the record. I actually really like this song. It isn't necessarily like a standout song on this record, but I do like it. The thing, of course, it makes me think of is I used to know a guy, and I didn't know him very well, but he was a guy that kind of was in my, sort of on the periphery of my peer group when I was younger, living in the Bay Area back in the late 1990s, and he was known as being a huffer. And I wasn't necessarily very good friends with him, but man, he was a sketchy dude. And I don't know if you've ever met anybody that was a huffer, but there's just something that's a little bit not right about them. When my wife and I first moved down to Nashville, the first house we lived in out here, we did not have a washer and dryer in the house that we lived in, so we had to go to this sort of scuzzy laundromat that was not far from our house. And there was a guy that used to hang out in there all the time, and he was a homeless guy. My heart goes out to him in a way, but he was always, he always had the spray paint in the paper bag. And I don't know if he sort of lived in that laundromat or what, but he was in there. I saw him in there probably like 3 or 4 times, and he would sort of open up the washing machine, and he'd be sitting kind of in the washing machine, and he would be in there huffing his spray paint. But there was always something about that guy I used to sort of know. I wasn't really good friends with him, but I used to know this guy that was a huffer. And there was just something about him that kind of like made my skin crawl. I do like the song Carbona Not Glue. As far as the songs on this record, I'd say it's one of the sort of lesser standouts, at least in my opinion. The next song after that is one of my favorites, not only on this record, but in the entire Ramones catalog. Susie is a headbanger. This is a song written about a girl that the Ramones used to see at shows in their early days, despite the fact that the Ramones call her mother a geek, which makes me think that this girl's mother wasn't particularly fond of the idea of her going to punk rock shows, probably hanging out in New York City in general by herself, most likely. But I get the impression, based on this song and the lyrics, that this was a girl that had caught the eye of at least one of the members of the band romantically, but it is supposedly written about a girl who was a regular at shows during the band's early days, despite her mother's protest. Side 1 ends with a song called Pinhead, a song that was inspired by the 1932 horror classic Freaks, a film by Todd Browning. Of course, Todd Browning went on to also, I should say, famously directed the movie Dracula. To me, this song is like a celebration of outcast status. It's sort of an anthem to throwaway kids everywhere. If you ever felt as if you were a throwaway kid within your general peer group, I know growing up, I always felt that way. I still do at times feel as if I am a bit of a loner, but I do remember the first time that I sort of discovered this type of music and the community that goes around it. Now, I grew up in a very small town in Northern California. I had one friend pretty much from 7th grade through the end of high school, and he and I were sort of a gang of two, and we didn't necessarily fit in with the people that we went to school with. And it wasn't until I got out of my high school and out of my hometown, and I really sort of started discovering this music and discovering the community that goes with it, where I really found kind of what I was looking for. And I remember, I mean, I've been listening to this kind of music for a long time now, son. I'm not a young lad anymore. But I do remember the first time I really discovered this kind of music and the community around it, how important it was to me, what it meant to me, why I'm still a fan all of these 30 years later, because when I discovered this kind of music, it was something that I felt was a part of me all along, but it was something that was missing and something that I had to go out in search of. Now, I don't know if you would want to say that this was like a vision quest type scenario, but it isn't unlike that either. When I first started buying these records and first started reading about these bands and seeing the people that went to shows, I suddenly felt like, man, I'm still kind of a weirdo, but I'm not as much of a weirdo as I think I am. There are other people out there who feel the way I do. And to me, the song Pinhead, it is like a celebration of outsider status. It is like we are a community. To me, this song is basically about punk rock. And of course, Pinhead is, it's one of the most iconic anthems within, the Ramones catalog. I also think it's very cool that it is inspired by the movie Freaks, which is one of the first things that my wife and I ever bonded on when my wife and I met as co-workers. And a couple things that we first bonded on. One was the movie High Fidelity, which is my favorite movie of all time. And two was the movie Freaks, because we were having a conversation about Dracula, which is one of my favorite movies of all time, the old Bela Lugosi Dracula, and we started talking about Todd Browning, and then she sort of introduced me to the movie Freaks, which, embarrassingly, I had never really seen before. But I went out and I think I rented it, or maybe we watched it together. It was one of the first things that we sort of bonded on when we were still just co-workers. But I love that song. Anyway, side 2 starts off with a song called Now I Want to Be a Good Boy. To me, this song, it sounds almost identical to the Ramones song, I Just Want to Sniff Some Glue. That being said, especially back in these early days, like I said before, the Ramones, sonically and stylistically, there wasn't a lot of diversity in their sound. So they have a tendency, there are songs within the Ramones catalog that sound like other songs. And I've heard people say, oh man, all Ramones songs sound exactly the same. And to me, I don't think you could be any more wrong. Now, there are songs like this one that sounds a little bit like I Just Want to Sniff Some Glue. But if you're going to write a song that sounds like another song, writing a song that sounds like I Want to Sniff Some Glue, pretty good to me. You could certainly do a lot worse. I mean, you could write a song that sounds like Love in an Elevator by Aerosmith, but nobody wants that. Well, there are probably people that want that. Grossly. But this song is about, it was written by Dee Dee Ramone, about when he ran away from home at 18, and sort of the some of the experiences he had during that adventure. I really like this song a lot. Like I said, it reminds me a lot of I Want to Sniff Some Glue. The next song after that is a song called Swallow My Pride. To me, this is another song that has kind of it reminds me of another Ramones song, which is Beat on the Brat. Another one of my favorites. To me, this song is about the frustration Joey felt. The song was written by Joey Ramone, and it's about his frustration he felt over the sort of lack of commercial success of the band's first album, which had come out in 1976. To me, this song is sort of it's kind of about, expectations versus reality. I think that the guys in the Ramones, apparently Joey, because he wrote the song, Joey Ramone thought that the band were going to become rock stars. They were going to be, riding around in stretch limousines. They were going to be snorting cocaine off porn stars' butt cheeks. But here we are, a year later, still living in my crappy apartment. Nobody's buying my records. We're still playing shows in front of just a couple of hundred people at these shitty little dive bars. We barely have enough money to go out on tour. I mean, this is not what I was expecting. I was expecting, champagne and caviar waiting for me at every stop along the road. I really love this song. Of course, the Ramones, playing the style of music that they played, back in 1976 in particular. It may have been wishful thinking to think that they were ever going to become these, giant rock stars on the same level as people like Journey and Foreigner and Foghat. And I'm not sure if that's what Joey Ramone wanted. It sounds like, at least if you go back and you listen to the lyrics of the song, it sounds like he was at least expecting a fair amount of success. And according to these lyrics, I would suggest that he was expecting a fair amount of lavish success, which, if the Ramones ever became one of the biggest bands in the world, I think it would have been completely snug. I think it would have been well-deserved. They were probably one of the best bands in the world at this point in time. In 1977, we're still basically, 5 years from the Smiths? Yeah. So at the time, they were one of the greatest bands in the world. But, playing this style of music, it just wasn't in the cards, son, in 1977. Sorry to tell you. I mean, you were revolutionary. You were cutting edge. Mainstream middle America was not ready for this. They wanted Jukebox Hero. They didn't want 53rd and 3rd, son. The next song after that is a song called What's Your Game? This song is about a girl named Mary Jane who is quite insane. I really do like this song. It's a fairly basic, self-explanatory, straightforward Ramones song. I like it. I'm not saying I don't like it. But as far as compared to some of the other works and compositions on this particular record, it's not so much of a standout, at least in my opinion. I do like it. There isn't really a song on this album I don't like. The next song after that, man, one of my favorite Ramones songs of all time, and that is their cover of the Riviera's classic California Sun. My favorite version of this song is the one that is in Rock and Roll High School in the movie. And there's just something on this song in particular about Johnny Ramone's guitar that every time I hear this song, it literally makes my head tingle. It is one of the best sounding guitar tones, or the way it's played or something. I'm not a musician. I don't really understand musician, dialect, or not dialect, but I don't really understand musician talk. But there's just something in the way that his guitar sounds when he hits that note, or when he hits the part after the vocal verse or chorus, that just every time I hear it, I never get tired of hearing the song California Sun by the Ramones and the Rivieras. I love their version of it too. I'm from California. I'm a California son. But again, this is one of those songs that is, even though it's an old standard, basically, this is a song that was just written for the Ramones to cover because of their pop sensibility and their talent for sort of taking these old songs from the 60s and modernizing them, and sort of injecting them with just enough like punk rock to just make them perfect. I mean, this is a perfect song. I was just talking to my friend the other day about like what makes a perfect song. And even though it's not a Ramones composition, the Ramones version of California Sun, to me, it's a perfect song. If you could make a compilation album of 20 perfect songs, for me, California Sun by the Ramones it's on there. I know it's a cover too. I can't help it. The next song after that is a song called Commando. Apparently the song is written by Dee Dee Ramone about growing up in Germany as a military brat. Lyrically, this song is relatively simple, but it is immensely effective. I mean, that was sort of Dee Dee Ramone's greatest gift as a songwriter. And I happen to think that Dee Dee Ramone is one of probably the 50 greatest songwriters of all time. It's simple, but it's effective. And I don't mean simple as in dumb. I'm not trying to dismiss him, but he just had a way of getting his point across that just fit perfectly into like the 2.5 minute long pop punk song. And Commando, I think it is a perfect illustration of why Dee Dee Ramone was such an incredible songwriter. The next song after that is You're Gonna Kill the Girl. We mentioned Connie Grip earlier on this channel, on this video. To me, this song has a real sort of pop 60s, almost like girl group kind of sound to it. The song was written by Joey Ramone about Dee Dee's relationship with Connie Grip. Of course, the title of the song is You're Gonna Kill the Girl. Probably a valid concern expressed by Joey in his songwriting, especially if you consider the nature of that relationship. It was probably safe to assume that at the time when Dee Dee Ramone and Connie Grip were together, that one of them may not escape alive. I mean, especially like I said, Connie Grip is well known in the folklore of the Ramones in their history, but I guarantee you that in 1977, Dee Dee Ramone was more than a handful himself. So you get those two sort of personalities together. It's basically a keg of dynamite. I mean, my most unhealthy relationship I ever had was with a girl I was with for 5 years, and we used to joke, and it was, even joking about it now is gross, but we used to joke that we were Sid and Nancy. Not that we were junkies, mind you. We weren't. I've never done a drug in my life apart from too much booze back in my prime. But that was our problem, was we were drinking buddies. That's how we met. And things were all, fine and good until we'd get a couple deep, which was basically a daily activity, at least it was for me back in those days. And we used to always tell people that we were Sid and Nancy. I sort of had this like Sid Vicious hair, like jet black, dyed, spiky Sid Vicious hair at the time too. So people always used to call us that just because they thought I looked like Sid Vicious. But it was like really, looking back on it, it was really gross how like nasty that relationship was. And I'm not picking on my ex-girlfriend. I was just as guilty as she was, son. But man, it makes me think of this song every time or it makes me think of that relationship every time I hear the song, You're Gonna Kill Her. This record ends with a song called You Should Never Have Opened That Door. It's well documented that at least Joey Ramone and I'm assuming, or Johnny Ramone also, Johnny and Joey Ramone, I'm assuming all of them, but it's well documented what huge horror movie fans they were. This song is basically a very, gruesome, it just is basically the song just sounds like a very gruesome kill scene in a old classic horror movie. I mean, I am a huge horror movie fan myself, so is my wife. Like I said before, that's one of the first things we bonded on was movies, High Fidelity and Todd Browning. But we are both huge horror movie fans. I think that's one of the things that we have most in common. We don't have a lot in common sometimes when it comes to our taste in music and other things, but we're both huge horror movie fans. And to me, the greatest horror movie of all time, if you haven't seen it, which you probably have, to me, the greatest horror movie of all time is the original Last House on the Left by Wes Craven. There's something about that movie. Of course, it was filmed, a lot of it was filmed in New York City. But to me, the thing that makes that movie so scary is, or the reason why it's my favorite horror movie of all time, is the first time I saw that movie was with my friend Tim. He and I were in probably middle school, maybe very beginning of high school, and like a lot of kids back in the 1980s, it was a big thing for us on Friday night. He and I spent a lot of weekends together, and it was a big thing on Friday night. You go to the video store, right? You remember that? You go to the video store, and Tim and I, we'd walk in, and we would immediately peel off over to the horror section. That was like our thing. We might occasionally go and rent some sort of, raunchy comedies if the covers of the comedy of the cassette were sort of disguised well enough to where our parents didn't know that there might be boobage in them, because as a middle school and high school kid, any film with boobage was held in very high regard. But Tim and I would always peel off over into the horror movie section. I remember it was like a thing where you could each rent one, or maybe you could rent 3 total, so you'd pick one and your friend would pick one, and then you'd have to agree on one. And I remember that he and I rented The Last House on the Left because of Wes Craven. And of course, Wes Craven went on to become a huge horror movie celebrity and created, the Nightmare on Elm Street and all that stuff, and Scream eventually, which we're not going to talk about right now. But my friend Tim and I were both huge fans of Nightmare on Elm Street, so I picked up Last House on the Left based on the fact that it was Wes Craven. And we got it home, and it's filmed in the 1970s, and it's very low budget. And I remember when the film first started, being kind of a kid and not really liking things that were low budget at the time, I was like, this doesn't look like it's going to be very good. But man, that movie, first off, it's just brilliant and amazing, but it scared the piss out of me as a middle school kid. I remember we watched it on a Saturday night because that movie scared me so bad. Because I tend to like horror movies that are more based in reality. I'm not big into, werewolves and, the paranormal. And, I'm big into, stuff that can happen. I'm into, slasher, being stalked, being hunted, like an animal. And that was the thing about Last House on the Left. The original one was, it was low budget. It was gritty. The film is all grimy. It's recorded, it's filmed a lot of it in New York City, and if you haven't seen it, the story is just so possible and scary. And I remember we watched that movie on a Saturday night because I was trying to play it cool because my friend was over. But I remember I didn't want to watch anything else scary after I watched that movie because I was freaked out. I was looking out the window of our house. And I remember hey, you want to watch Saturday Night Live? And I think we had other movies to watch, and my friend Tim was like, yeah, okay, we can watch Saturday Night Live. Because I personally, I wanted to watch something funny after watching Last House on the Left. And I think that's why it's still my favorite horror movie to this day, because that was a movie that just freaked me out, man. The first time I saw it. It's a movie that I always have to own. Not long before Wes Craven passed away, he did a remake of it. And apparently when he did the remake, it's like, this is a movie I always wanted to make when I made Last House on the Left. Because, it was so low budget, I was young, I didn't know anything. And the remake it's okay. I didn't hate it. There's some scenes that he kind of added in that I didn't necessarily love. He also did the same thing with The Hills Have Eyes, which the original Hills Have Eyes, whew, that's another one that I love. He redid The Hills Have Eyes, which actually the remake of The Hills Have Eyes is better than the remake of Last House on the Left, I would suggest. But for me, if you want to see the greatest horror movie ever made, it's probably not even the greatest horror movie ever made. It sticks with me because of how much it scared me the first time I saw it, and that is the original Last House on the Left. Another thing that has always stuck with me is Leave Home by the Ramones. You see that segue right there? Man, that was like a work of art, son. Anyway, if you haven't gone back and checked out the Ramones' Leave Home recently or at all, I would highly suggest that you get on that task as soon as possible. It is a record that I do not believe will disappoint you. As I mentioned before at the very beginning, this is a record that to me is an essential. It is a punk rock classic. Just not quite as good as the Ramones' self-titled debut album from 1976 or Rocket to Russia, the record that came out after this. I mean, it's hard to pick like my favorite Ramones record. But I guess if I had to pick, I'd say Rocket to Russia, the one after this, is probably my favorite. It's easily the one that I listen to the most. I mean, that record is just the jugs. So go back and check out all of them. I mean, you can't go wrong with any of the Ramones records up to like the late 80s. Especially the records with the original lineup with Tommy on drums. No disrespect to Marky. I mean, when Marky joined the band, the Ramones were still pretty snug, in my opinion, but just not quite as good as they were in their original incarnation. Anyway, man, thank you so much for checking out this video. This is Archaic Records. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. Be sure to go out and support your local record store. Check back most weeks for Morrissey Monday, a weekly celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths, as well as other record content and album reviews throughout the week. And until next time, my friends, I'll talk to you then.